I think especially like that's a perfect example of like, yeah, it was a hard foul and it should have been dealt with in the moment and they should have decided what it was then and reviewed it. Great. We move on. You see it happen in the NBA all the time. It's not anything more than that. It's basketball. When I walk out of the locker room, I shouldn't be not fearful of what the conversation is going to be, but
for the people actually living inside the story, the most exhausting part may be that the conversation keeps moving further and further away from basketball. What should begin with a hard foul, a difficult game, or a performance on the court can quickly become something much bigger once the cameras turn on and the discussion shifts toward personalities, motives, culture, and character. And that tension is exactly what comes through in the interview. The speaker makes a simple distinction. Basketball is supposed to be the place where competition happens. A hard foul can be reviewed, dealt with, and then left behind. In the NBA, those moments happen. The expectation is that once the decision is made, the game continues. But when every incident becomes another opportunity to stir up a larger narrative, the emotional weight doesn't necessarily end when the final whistle does. That is where the frustration becomes personal. The speaker describes walking out of the locker room and not knowing what the next conversation is going to be about. Not because of the game itself, but because the questions may no longer be about what happened between the lines. Instead, there is an expectation that the conversation will turn into something else. And that uncertainty changes the experience. The speaker describes it as emotionally exhausting and draining, even physically creating tension because of the expectation that people are going to take something from the game and turn it into a larger controversy. But then the issue becomes even more complicated. There is a difference between being criticized and being characterized. Athletes understand that reporters and commentators have jobs to do. The speaker explicitly acknowledges that. An opinion piece can be written. A question can be asked. A performance can be analyzed. None of that is necessarily the problem. The line gets crossed, in the speaker's view, when people begin making accusations about someone's character without actually knowing that person. That distinction matters because it explains why the frustration isn't simply about negative coverage. It's about feeling that the public version of a person can become detached from the person who actually exists behind the cameras. The speaker puts it bluntly, people can do their jobs, but they should not make accusations about who someone is when they have never even had a conversation with them. And underneath all of that is something much simpler. The reason to play is still the game itself. The speaker talks about stepping between the lines, competing, loving basketball, chasing championships, and refusing to let outside noise take away the joy that originally made the sport meaningful. That creates the real tension at the center of this story. The bigger the attention becomes, the harder it can be to keep the conversation where the players want it, on basketball. And if that boundary keeps disappearing, the next question is unavoidable. How much of the pressure surrounding the players is actually coming from the game, and how much is being created by everything happening around it? Once the conversation moves beyond the players themselves, the story takes on a much more suspicious shape. The transcript begins presenting a larger theory about how the media narrative surrounding Caitlin Clark was being constructed, and this is where an important distinction has to be made. There is a difference between what the narrator claims, what the source material demonstrates, and what remains speculation. The narrator argues that major sports networks have historically had enormous influence over which athletes receive attention, how their achievements are presented, and which stories become part of the broader sports conversation. That argument then becomes more specific, with claims that Clark's rise created a problem for established media narratives because her popularity and statistical production made her difficult to ignore. From there, the allegations become much stronger. The transcript claims that historical graphics and record comparisons were being presented with selective statistical filters designed to minimize Clark's achievements. It describes qualifiers being added to comparisons and argues that these choices could change how viewers understood where Clark stood historically. But this is exactly where the story requires caution. The supplied transcript presents those claims as part of its narrative, yet it does not provide the underlying evidence needed to independently establish that a coordinated network operation actually existed. There are no documented internal communications, no identified executive instructions, and no independently demonstrated chain of decision-making in the material provided. So the strongest version of the claim remains an allegation. That doesn't make the media discussion irrelevant. It makes the distinction between evidence and interpretation even more important. There is a real difference between a broadcaster choosing a particular statistical qualification for a graphic and proving that executives deliberately designed that qualification to erase a player from the record books. The first can be observed in a broadcast. The second requires evidence of intent. And the transcript repeatedly moves from the first kind of observation toward the second kind of conclusion. That shift is what creates the hidden story appeal. If the graphics were simply different statistical comparisons, there may be a debate about methodology. But if someone could actually demonstrate that those comparisons were intentionally selected to diminish one particular player, the significance would be dramatically different. The same pattern appears when the narrator moves from media coverage toward the idea of deliberately creating friction inside the Indiana Fever locker room. The transcript claims that a respected player was supposedly needed to legitimize an anti-Clark narrative and identifies Kelsey Mitchell as the person allegedly targeted. Again, the supplied material establishes that this is the narrator's interpretation. It does not independently prove the existence of such a coordinated strategy. And that distinction becomes crucial because the story is now moving from criticism of coverage into an accusation about institutional intent. The further the narrative travels in that direction, the more important one question becomes: are we looking at evidence of a deliberate campaign, or are we looking at a series of media decisions that the narrator has connected into a larger theory? That question doesn't weaken the story. It makes the next piece of it even more important, because if Kelsey Mitchell was really placed at the center of this controversy, what did she actually say when the cameras were on her? And this is where Kelsey Mitchell becomes central to the story. The reason her role matters is not simply that she is another player caught in the middle of a media controversy. The transcript presents her as an established veteran scorer who had already spent years with the Fever through rebuilding seasons, giving her a very different perspective from someone who had only recently arrived in the spotlight. That history is important because the narrator's theory depends on one particular assumption, that the growing attention around Caitlin Clark could potentially create tension inside the team. The transcript portrays Mitchell as someone who might have been expected to feel overshadowed by the enormous attention surrounding her younger teammate. But that's the narrator's interpretation, not something the supplied material independently proves. What is clear is that the media narrative was increasingly focused on Clark, and that Mitchell was eventually placed in a position where questions surrounding that narrative could involve the relationship between teammates. That's where the anticipation begins to build. Because a player can ignore a headline. A player can disagree with an article. But a live interview is different. When the cameras are rolling and a question is framed in a particular way, there is no opportunity to rewrite the answer afterward. And according to the transcript, that was precisely the moment the story reached Mitchell. The narrator describes the questions as loaded and suggests that the reporter was attempting to frame Clark's playing style as a potential problem for the team's veteran core. The stated interpretation is that the interview could have produced a controversial soundbite, something that might make the tension inside the team appear much greater than it actually was. But again, there is a line between what the transcript claims and what we can actually establish from the supplied material. We can establish that the interview happened within this larger media discussion. We can establish that Mitchell was being discussed as an important veteran within the Fever environment. What we cannot establish from this transcript alone is that a network deliberately engineered the interview as part of a coordinated operation. And that makes Mitchell's actual words more important than the narrator's theory. Because whatever assumptions existed before the microphone reached her, the answer would ultimately come from the player herself. Would she distance herself from Clark? Would she reinforce the idea of tension inside the team? Or would she reject the premise altogether? That is the moment the story has been building toward. The speculation can only take us so far. The next part comes down to what was actually said. And once the actual interview begins, the story changes. The speculation about networks, narratives, and motives suddenly becomes secondary because now there is something much more concrete to examine: what was actually said. The first important point is that the speaker does not treat every controversial moment as evidence of some larger conflict. A hard foul, for example, is described as something that should have been dealt with in the moment, reviewed if necessary, and then left behind. The comparison is simple: these things happen in basketball, and once they have been handled, the players should be able to move on. But the frustration begins when that doesn't happen. The speaker describes walking out of the locker room with uncertainty about what the next conversation will become. The problem isn't simply being asked about a controversial play. It's the expectation that the discussion will be pushed beyond the game itself. And that pressure is described in unusually personal terms. It's emotionally exhausting. It's draining. It creates tension because there is an awareness that people may not actually want to discuss the basketball. They may want to take the incident and turn it into something larger. That is an important distinction because it changes the conflict from a disagreement about coverage into a question of what it feels like to live under that coverage. Then the conversation becomes even more personal. The speaker is asked about the way they are portrayed compared with how they see themselves. The response is not that criticism itself should disappear. In fact, the speaker openly acknowledges that reporters and bloggers have jobs to do. People can write opinion pieces. People can analyze what they see. The objection is to something more specific, being characterized by people who do not actually know you. The speaker says there is sometimes a false characterization of who they are and acknowledges that journalism and commentary are professions. But then comes the boundary: don't make accusations about someone's character when you've never even had a conversation with them. That makes the moment much more revealing than a simple media complaint. Because underneath the argument about coverage is a question of identity. Who gets to define an athlete? Is it the person who plays the game every night? Or is it the people watching from outside who construct a public version of that person through articles, commentary, clips, and social media? The speaker clearly believes there is a difference between those two things. And then comes perhaps the most important part of the interview. After discussing the pressure, the criticism, and the feeling of being misunderstood, the speaker returns to why they play in the first place. It's the competition. It's the feeling of stepping between the lines. It's the dream of winning championships. And despite everything happening around the game, that love hasn't been taken away. The speaker says that outside criticism has not, and will not, take away that joy or the motivation to keep competing. That is what makes the interview emotionally significant. The story begins with a debate about media coverage, but the underlying issue becomes much more human. What happens when the noise surrounding an athlete starts competing with the reason they became an athlete in the first place? And if the pressure isn't coming from the competition itself, then the next question is where that pressure actually comes from, and whether the line between legitimate coverage and personal judgment has already become too difficult to see. And that brings the conversation to the line that matters most: where does legitimate coverage end, and where does personal judgment begin? The speaker doesn't argue that athletes should be protected from criticism. In fact, the interview makes room for the opposite. Reporters have a profession. Bloggers have a profession. Writing opinion pieces is part of that profession, and the speaker openly acknowledges that people are going to have their opinions. So the issue isn't criticism itself. The issue is what happens when criticism stops being about what happened on the court and starts becoming a judgment about who someone supposedly is. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. A reporter can question a decision. A commentator can disagree with a performance. Someone can write an opinion saying an athlete handled a situation badly. Those are arguments about actions. But saying you know someone's character when you've never actually spoken to them is something different. That's the frustration expressed in the interview. The speaker acknowledges the other side's right to do their job, while simultaneously insisting that doing that job does not mean having unlimited authority to define another person's identity. And there is a deeper reason that boundary matters. For an athlete, the public version of their personality can become almost impossible to escape. One comment becomes a headline. One moment becomes a clip. One opinion becomes a description that gets repeated until people begin treating it as established fact. The person inside that story, meanwhile, still has to walk into the locker room, step onto the court, compete, and live with the consequences of whatever narrative has developed around them. That is why the speaker's frustration isn't simply, "Don't criticize me." It's closer to, "You don't know me." Those are very different statements. The first asks for immunity from criticism. The second asks for a boundary between analyzing someone's actions and claiming authority over their character. And the interview keeps returning to that boundary. Because beneath all the commentary, the speaker says the reason for playing is remarkably straightforward. It's the competition. It's the ability to step between the lines and do something they have dreamed about doing. It's the desire to win championships and help the team accomplish something meaningful. That creates an interesting contradiction at the heart of the entire controversy. The more attention an athlete receives, the more people want to interpret every action. But the more those interpretations move away from the actual game, the less connected they may become to the reason the athlete is there in the first place. And that's where legitimate criticism has to be separated from personal characterization. You can debate the play. You can debate the decision. You can debate the performance. But once the argument becomes a claim about someone's character, the standard should be different, especially when the person making that judgment has never actually had a conversation with the person they're describing. And that leaves the audience with a much harder question than simply deciding who was right. How much criticism is part of being a professional athlete, and at what point does the conversation stop analyzing the game and start creating a person who exists mainly in the eyes of the audience? But there is another side to this conversation, and this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because it is possible to agree that the constant media attention is exhausting while still believing that an athlete has some responsibility for how they participate in the larger conversation surrounding the league. That is essentially where the next discussion goes. After hearing the comments about being fearful of the conversation after games and feeling drained by the constant attention, the response does not simply dismiss those feelings. The commentator acknowledges that the experience can be emotional and that the frustration is understandable. But then comes the qualification. Caitlin Clark is described as a young, major star in the WNBA, a player whose presence has become an important part of the league's larger story. And because of that position, the commentator argues that there may also be room for more accountability and self-awareness regarding her role within the broader WNBA community. That doesn't necessarily erase the original complaint. In fact, the two ideas can exist at the same time. A player can feel exhausted by the way they are covered and still have a responsibility to understand how their actions affect the wider league. A commentator can believe an athlete should show more accountability while also recognizing that the surrounding discourse has become exhausting. And that is what makes this part of the discussion more interesting than simply choosing a winner. The disagreement isn't really over whether the attention exists. It does. The disagreement is over what that attention means and who carries responsibility for the way the conversation develops. One side emphasizes the experience of being constantly discussed, analyzed, and characterized from the outside. The other emphasizes the responsibility that comes with becoming one of the league's most visible figures. Then there is an important point of agreement. The commentator also says that it is exhausting for people who genuinely want to celebrate the league and the basketball being played to watch the larger discourse become so disappointing. That changes the shape of the debate. It is no longer simply players versus media. It becomes a question about everyone involved in the conversation. Players have influence. Reporters have influence. Commentators have influence. Fans have influence. And every group can contribute to making the discussion either more constructive or more divisive. The source even ends this exchange by emphasizing the responsibility to focus on the game itself, the basketball that everyone involved supposedly loves. So perhaps the most revealing part of this debate is that both perspectives contain a version of the same frustration. One side is saying, don't turn everything into something bigger than basketball. The other is saying, when you're one of the league's biggest stars, your role in that bigger conversation matters. Those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive positions. And that leaves the audience with the question the earlier sections could not fully answer. If everyone agrees that the discourse has become exhausting, then who is actually responsible for changing it? And after everything that has been said, the biggest question may no longer be who won the argument. It may be what happens when the conversation surrounding a player becomes bigger than the player herself. The interview gives us something concrete. We hear a player describe the emotional exhaustion of constantly dealing with conversations that move beyond basketball. We hear the frustration of being characterized by people who, in her words, do not actually know her. And we hear something equally important on the other side of that frustration, the desire to keep competing, keep improving, and ultimately win. Those are the parts of the story we can directly evaluate. Then there are the interpretations. The supplied narration makes much stronger claims about networks, institutional motives, manipulated statistics, and an alleged effort to create conflict around Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever. Those claims form a major part of the video's narrative, but the transcript itself does not provide enough underlying evidence to establish them as confirmed facts. That distinction matters. Because once a story becomes emotionally powerful, it becomes very easy for interpretation to start sounding like evidence. The same thing happens in the wider debate. The later commentary introduces another perspective. Clark can be a major star whose experience with constant media attention deserves empathy, while also potentially having responsibilities within the larger WNBA community. At the same time, the commentator agrees that the surrounding discourse can be exhausting for people who simply want to celebrate the basketball. So there is no simple ending here. There is no need to pretend that one side has completely defeated the other. The more interesting conclusion is that the league now exists in a space where basketball, media attention, public identity, and cultural debate are constantly overlapping. And that creates a difficult problem. The more attention a player receives, the more valuable every moment becomes to the media. The more valuable those moments become, the more likely every incident is to be analyzed. And the more every incident is analyzed, the harder it becomes for the athlete to control the story surrounding her. Eventually, the coverage can become its own story. That's the larger implication behind everything we've heard. The interview isn't proof of every allegation made by the narrator. The commentator's response isn't proof that every criticism of Clark is justified either. What the material does show is a genuine tension over where the conversation should go, and who gets to decide what that conversation becomes. The speaker wants the game to remain the center. The commentators are debating the responsibilities that come with becoming one of the league's biggest stars. And the media ecosystem continues to turn those disagreements into another layer of the story. Which brings us back to the simplest question of all. Can the conversation eventually return to basketball? Or has the attention surrounding the biggest names in the WNBA become so powerful that the discussion around the game is now almost as important as the game itself? Because once the story becomes bigger than the player is no longer the only thing being watched. Everything around her becomes part of the spectacle. And that may be the real challenge facing this next era of the WNBA, not whether the attention will continue, but whether everyone involved can keep that attention from overwhelming the basketball that created it in the first place.